Welcome to Leadership Rediscovered. I'm your host, Laura Siebold, and today I am so excited to be joined by Morgan O'Brien, who is the CEO of Hope Gas. Morgan previously served the roles as president and CEO of Peoples Natural Gas Company, LLC, and Duquesne Light Company. He brings more than 18 years of experience leading as CEO of two important public utility companies serving their regions. Peoples Natural Gas Company, LLC, affiliated utility serves approximately 740,000 customers in southwestern PA, West Virginia, and Kentucky from February 1st, 2010 until March 16th, 2020. In that capacity, Morgan was responsible for the company's strategic, operational, and financial performance. Prior to joining Peoples Natural Gas in February 2010, O'Brien served as president and CEO of Duquesne Light Holdings from September 2001 to January 2010. Duquesne Light Company serves approximately 600,000 customers in southwestern Pennsylvania. At Duquesne Light, O'Brien refocused the company as a solidly performing electricity utility and community partner. Duquesne Light became the top performing electric utility in safety and customer service under O'Brien's leadership. O'Brien joined Duquesne Light in 1991, holding several senior executive positions before becoming CEO. Prior to his tenure at Duquesne, he served in various management positions at PNC Bank and major accounting firms. Upon joining Peoples Natural Gas, O'Brien reestablished the 100-plus-year-old company in western Pennsylvania. The company had significantly grown its employment in the region and has brought nearly 300 new jobs back to the region and created a high-performing customer service center in Pittsburgh. In addition, he orchestrated the largest infrastructure improvement and modernization project in the company's history. The company has committed to a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar investment program to meet the growing energy needs of the region, and that will dramatically improve the environmental impacts to the region, and in particular, the quality of air in the region. During his tenure as CEO, the company has dramatically improved its safety record, improving to the top quartile of AGA gas utilities. In May 2011, Peoples TWP, formerly TW Phillips Gas and Oil Company, was purchased and became a sister company to Peoples Natural Gas. And in December 2013, Peoples acquired Equitable Gas. And most recently, Peoples acquired Delta Gas in Kentucky. With these acquisitions, Peoples is now the largest natural gas distribution company in Pennsylvania and serves thousands of customers in West Virginia and Kentucky as well. O'Brien has positioned Hope Gas as a true community partner and champion. The company vision is to invest and partner with many organizations that drive economic development and improve the quality of life in West Virginia. Under his leadership, the company's mission is to make the lives of all of its customers better. To that end, its vision of going above and beyond customer expectations is now becoming a key part of the company's day-to-day operations. This means exceeding expectations on every phone call and service call and being more compassionate with customers who have challenges affording their energy bills. This culture is consistently on display as Hope's employees volunteer their time and resources for charitable causes throughout the year. O'Brien earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and master's degree in taxation from Robert Morris University. He is active in civic organizations throughout the region, including the board of trustees of his alma mater. He serves on many boards, some of which include Matthews International, Watt Fuel Cell, and Pittsburgh Works Together, an economic development group partnering with labor leaders and corporate leaders. Oh, I'm so excited to talk to you.
Wow.
What an impressive background.
Who is this guy?
He sounds so great, right?
I can't wait to meet him.
I can't believe I got him on this podcast.
I know. Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. This is going to be a great conversation. And I had the good fortune of having lunch with you ahead of time so we could have a little bit of a preliminary conversation. So hopefully I don't make you repeat too many things.
That's okay.
But I did hear some great stories that I want everybody else to hear as well.
Absolutely.
I think it'd be helpful. The bio that I just read did a really nice job of walking through the professional organization history, but I just want to hear, in your words, the leadership journey that you've been on thus far, because I know that is very impressive as well.
Yeah, and it's journey is definitely the right way to describe it, right? Because like all of us, you have certain beliefs and certain, I'll call it biases that you think good leaders have. And then as your career and as you watch, and I'll say as you both have mentorships and both positive and negative, right?
Yeah.
You react to all that. So, for me, what was interesting is I never set out to be a CEO of the company. I mean, honestly, people will say to me, like, I'll talk to undergraduate class, like, how do you become CEO? And honestly, when I started my career, it was like, it was never on my radar. And I don't know where it came about, but I always had this belief because, it's sort of my background. I'm from a lower middle class immigrant father, hardworking, and, taught early on in life that a job is a gift and it's not an entitlement. And, you should always treat it as a gift, right? Which is different than what am my compensation going to be? Why don't I have more pay, right? As opposed to just thank you, right?
Yes,
just
that's how I was raised too. Just say thank you.
Absolutely. And so that was my starting point. And I also was as I started my career, I developed this view that I wasn't smarter than anybody, right? Like everybody has different experience, different knowledge. But the one thing I knew is that I could work hard. And I used to have this strategy that, like, I may not be smarter than you, but I can outwork you, right?
Hey, that's a big deal, though.
Yeah. And so I started never saying no to projects, always taking things on. And then I found out that I was good at solving problems, which doesn't necessarily come out in your academic background, right? But you sit there and you just think about how to solve different problems. And then the other thing I found out about myself is that I wasn't afraid to take chances. And mostly because I always felt like I worked hard enough and I had my head around things mostly enough, but also I learned early on in my career to be a really good listener. And I would listen to, and I'll never forget one of the first business meetings I ever went to. I just graduated from college. I was going to set the world on fire. I was working for a CPA firm, and there was a company buying a company, and the person who was sort of the partner on this engagement pulled me aside and said, listen, we know what we know, and our job isn't to convince them how much we know. Our job is to figure out what they know, right?
Ooh.
And it was funny, and that stayed with me forever. So every business meeting, it was about listening, right? And then, taking it in, asking lots of questions, and not necessarily, that was a negotiation. So there was a reason you didn't want to share what you knew, but really paying attention to people and listening to people. And it was, sort of all through my career, I found out that, there are people that would sit in meetings and not talk, right? And then I would listen to them talk outside the meeting, and they had a lot to say. And, I was struck by that. And it was just like, a couple of times I'd ask folks, like, why didn't you say that in the meeting? It's like, nobody wants to hear that, right? And that was something that stayed with me. And, so I think I'd say part of my career was I worked very hard. I was a good listener, and I think I could solve problems. And that was an ingredient that helped keep me moving throughout it. And, one of the other things, and I say it to anybody who will listen, that, being a happy person and being a nice person, people want to be around you, right? And so,
it's so simple.
It's so simple.
Hard
right?
for some
It's so
people.
hard, right? Like you learn that in kindergarten, right? You go in, and if you share your toys, and if you, compliment people on, oh my gosh, you're so good at that, right? Those kind of things, right? And that stayed with me, and I tell that to my kids as they start out in business. They'll say, what's some of the things we should do? And I'll say, like, come to work and, like, be pleasant around, right? There's problems, there's issues. Everybody's got their headaches, right? Everybody does. And some people wear it, and other people, it's, not who you want to be. And so that was part of my, early on, I decided, what, I'm just going to be somebody who people want to be around, right? And that's okay, right? It's a good thing.
Yeah.
And so then it was like, okay, he works hard, he's easy to get along with, right? And so you start putting the ingredients.
Problems.
Yeah, and you never sit there and say, you chart it out, right?
Yes.
But you just start saying, this is who I want to be.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was seeing people who weren't that way, right? There was the really smart person who you worked with, who everybody said is arrogant, you hate to talk to them, but they're really smart. And it's like, okay, how does that outweigh the fact that you don't like dealing with them, right?
Yeah.
And so, to me, it was like you can be a little bit of everything. You don't have to be everything of everything.
Yeah.
So, and that began my journey. And again, I never set out to be a chief executive officer. And sometimes I think maybe that was probably beneficial in becoming one.
Yes.
Because it wasn't, I always took opportunities without necessarily knowing where it was going to take me. And so there were times I was offered promotions sideways and sometimes in a completely different area. And I never said no to any one of them. And I kept thinking, I'm going to learn something from this, right? I'm going to be a better, whatever I end up being. Like, this is a good opportunity for me to learn something else. And then whenever I did that, it was always, I went into it. And I actually today, one of my business principles is I love putting people in areas, especially to manage, that they don't know anything about, right? Because what it does, it forces them to listen to the people who do it.
Oh, right? That's so good.
It's awesome, right? And so some of the best, I'll call it management changes I've made is to take somebody who's an expert in something and really a good professional and then put them in an area and you tell them, right? Like you don't need to know everything.
Yeah, you're there to lead.
You're there to lead.
Yeah.
And a leader isn't about telling people what to do.
Yeah.
It's about listening to them and empowering them and making them feel safe, right?
Yes.
And how important they are, right? And what I found is when you don't know the subject, they're really important to you, right? Because they're what's keeping you going.
Yeah.
And so you naturally become a good, I'll call it a good leader by listening, empowering people, out of necessity.
You have to. And that's a very humbling experience for people too. I love that concept.
And so for me, my career, I started off, I was a CPA and I worked in taxes, and then next thing I know, I was controller, and then I went over to operations. At one time, at the electric company, I had nuclear power plants operations reporting to me, and I was a CPA. And I would sit in those meetings like scared to death, and I would say to them, tell me everything you know and tell me what keeps you up night, right? And so like we'd have really good discussions and people liked it because they felt important. Once they got over the fact that their boss didn't know anything, right? You have to be able to live with that.
Well, but you have to learn how to bring other type of value. If you aren't the subject matter expert, then it's, okay, how else can I contribute to this team?
Yeah. And so that I'll say that path sort of led me sort of just keep taking steps up. And then eventually, I'll never forget it. Like one day, the board of directors asked me if I'd, can be up for being CEO. And I was at a young age. And, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this has never been my goal.
Yeah.
And the other phenomena that I never told too many people is up until that point in time, I said, what's the worst thing that can happen to me? I get fired. I'll find another job tomorrow. I work hard. I know what I'm doing, right? All of a sudden, like when you're CEO, it's like, if I get fired tomorrow, I may not find another job, right? There's not a million of those jobs out there.
That's true. And you feel the weight of the responsibility of leading that many people. Because it's again, even if you were leading a department, there's still responsibility there. But I feel like, okay, that's a different level when it's the company.
Absolutely. And my biggest thing, so I was all excited about it. I took it, right? Because who turns it down? But I remember driving home that night thinking, this is the first job I've ever had in my life. If they fire me, I don't know what I don't know I'd be able to replicate it, right?
Yeah.
And then the other side of it was, and I thought a lot about this, was that the person who preceded me was probably one of the most intelligent people I ever worked with. He was really well educated. I mean, he had all the tools to be really successful. And I would sit there and watch him make bad decision after bad decision, right? And so then I was like, oh my gosh, I got to work the hardest I've ever worked, right? Because I'm not as smart as him. I'm not as educated as him. And, even though I've got, I think, good skill sets, right? Like I don't have to work so hard to make up for
big shoes to fill, huh?
Yeah, for like my lack of being able to do this. And then he failed. Like his business strategy honestly failed. And I'll never forget it. I attributed his failure to the fact that he surrounded himself with people who told him not the truth, but what he wanted to hear, right? And so no matter how smart you are, if you're hearing that from whoever, right, you don't have a chance of making decisions, right? And I just remember I'd sit in meetings and I'd be like, I know that's not true. And it would drive me crazy. So when I got into that chair, I'm like, how do you protect yourself from that, right? It's a scary thing. Like no matter who those people are, no matter who I pick,
yes.
how do I know they're going to tell me the truth?
And even if you say, because I want to hear your perspective on how do you know? Because I think even when you say, no, I really want to know.
Oh, absolutely.
I still think sometimes you're getting a filtered response. What types of things do you do to?
Yeah. So I know when I first took over, because I was completely paranoid of that issue, right? So I spent the first 2 months, I didn't meet with any of my direct reports, which drove them all crazy, right? Because everybody's calling, getting on my calendar, want to talk about their ideas on what I need to do. And I just said to my assistant, I'm not meeting with anybody unless it's like an emergency, the building's on fire, no meetings for like the first 2 months. And I spent 2 months out in the field sitting with crews of teams of people and literally explaining to them that, the predecessor who they would sit and watch decisions and they would say, those are bad decisions. Like from their level. They're
at front line.
They're at front line, right? And I'll never forget the story. There was a group of folks and I'm sitting in it was a little shop with like blue collar, hardworking people who care about keeping people's energy going on in the worst of weather, right? I call them like public servants, right?
Yeah.
They're keeping your energy on the night you don't want to go outside,
yes.
right? And so I was sitting there with them, and they asked me, "Are you they?" Right? And I'm like, "Who is they?" Right? Because we're having this conversation. Like, I need to hear the truth. You got to share with me what you know. And the one guy says to me, "Are you they?" And I'm like, "Who's they?" And he said, "Our supervisor gives us a job to do." And we say, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like there's issues with it. And he said, I don't care. This is what they told me to do, right?
They.
Right?
Yes.
And it's no ownership on the supervisor.
Right.
He's
oh, no, I'm just the messenger. Don't get mad at me.
Don't get mad at me.
Told me to do it.
And by the way, don't give me any feedback because I'm not going back to they.
I'm not taking it
back. And they said, so we're trying to figure out who they is.
Wow.
And I'm like, I am they.
Yeah.
Like I'm going to be they.
It's me.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they told me this story, and I was familiar with the backdrop of it, but I didn't know the inside story. That there was a part of the system that was really bad, and there were a lot of problems with it. And the company said, we're going to spend money to fix it, right? And they came out, and I'll never forget. This guy says to me, he looked at the plans, and he said, that's not going to work. And he got the they story, right? The supervisor said, listen. There's a whole bunch of people that planned this. They put the plans together, and he's like, I don't care. This isn't going to work. And they're like, your job's to execute it, not to ask questions. Just do it, right?
Wow.
So he said, we sat there and did that, and we thought, oh, this company's spending all this money on this.
It's not going to work.
And it's not going to work. And sure enough, it didn't work, right? And so I'm sitting there like, listen, if that happens under my watch.
Chomping at the bit.
I gave them all my cell phone number.
Wow.
I said, call me. Don't go to some supervisor. If the worst thing that happens, call me, right? And I will come here and listen to you, and I won't let that happen, right? Wow. And it was funny, right? Because everything's a journey, right? So you do that once, right? It's like, okay. So I went around and did all that, and I kept making my list. Like, here are all the things we need to do. And then after 2 months, I met with the senior team, and I had like 14 things that we had to do, right? And everybody sat there and was like, where'd you get that list?
Yeah, that's not on my list of things I wanted to meet with you on.
And I'm like, so let's talk about each of these. Are these real issues? And every one of them was a legitimate issue, right? And they all came from people in the field, the things we weren't doing. And so you sit there, and I said to them, this is the whole story of like, follow me, right? And I actually thought, okay, I'm going to get this leadership team, right? So I'm like, this came, and I just went through, and I said, here's where I heard this story. Here's where I heard this. Here's where I heard that. And they report to you, and they report to you. And so that's what you need to be doing. Like if you're gonna be successful here, you need to be doing that, right? And I was like, so this is going to work, right? I'm going to get people that are going to be engaged. And like everybody shook their head and said, oh, that makes so much sense. Yeah, right. And then like they're not doing it, right? Because they're in their safe world, and so that like no one's out there. And I kept doing it, and I would say, So has so and so been here? Nope, haven't seen them. Right, haven't seen them. Right, and it's funny. So fast forward to today. You read my little bio there. So Hope, we're buying Peoples West Virginia, which was part of a company that I used to run, right?
Yeah.
And so as part of the sale, we have to get approval in Charleston, and so that takes time. Yeah. But the seller asked if we could come and meet with the employees, right? So keep in mind, these folks worked for me for when I was running it, right?
Yeah.
And so the guy who runs the company who took over after I left gives this little speech. We're down in Fairmont. He says, this is the buyer. This is Morgan O'Brien, yada, yada. And I get up and I start talking to them. And a couple of the folks come over after the formal discussion. And they said to me, Morgan, we've never seen that guy. Like the guy who is running the business, right? He's never been here before. And the last person who's been here was you when you were in it, right?
Wow.
And it was so, to this day, right, it's one of those things that honestly, I know I'm not smart enough to be able to figure out what's really happening. So the only way I think as a leader you can ever really get comfortable is that reconciliation where you go down and you go back where it's happening. This is what I hear. Is this what's happening? Or what issues are there, right? And you reconcile, what you're hearing versus what you're seeing, right? And it's hard. I tell people it takes a lot of work. But when you're not real smart and you're not the brightest guy in the room like me, it's the only way you can succeed, right? And then what happens, because people will say to me, right, so I go around Hope and they'll say, okay, are we ever going to see you again? And,
they're probably real cynical.
Yeah, because people that's not what they're used to. And I say to them, listen, here's how I hold myself accountable, and you could help me with this. So if I say I'm going to do something and I come back and I haven't done it, you need to call me out on it, right? Or if you've identified some issue and we're not thinking about it, call me out on it, right? And then it's okay, if you're going to do that, if you're going to go out and engage with your employees and then hold yourself accountable, you're going to make sure you have lists. You start keeping lists. Right. Yes. I don't want to say, oh, my gosh, I forgot about your point. Right.
Right. Because that won't make them feel listened to.
No. And all of that. Right. So and you've been studying leadership for quite a while is when you engage with people and listen and truly listen to them.
Yes.
And not only listen to them, but then they hear their thoughts and comments becoming actions. Right. One of my, I'll call it favorite utility stories. Right. So utilities, there's electric, gas, water, right? All these utilities. And there's a lot of similarities between, I'll say a utility and sometimes government, right? These are typically people that work there a long time. It's
very regulated.
Very regulated. And, it's not, nobody's thinking outside the box, right? And so everything's just, I show up for work, I do my job. At the end of the day, I'll get a good pension, get my health benefits, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so you sort of lull yourself into that's who you are, right?
Way into the comfort zone too.
Yeah, way into the comfort zone. And, I've tried to sort of take a step back and I tell people, first of all, what you do is really important. There's a whole bunch of people that depend on you.
For sure.
And the only thing I can add to what you do is I can, one, make you feel safe, you're important here. And if there are things you think we should be doing, tell me what they are. And if there's reasons we can't do them, my job will be to try to figure out how to eliminate those barriers that stop us, right? Yeah. And so I've taken it to just listening to people about problems to say, what can I do to help you become more effective, right? And that's a fairly, okay, now they do feel important, right? Because and if they see the change that happens.
Yeah.
And I've historically, it's sort of been my personality. People will come to me with the crazy idea.
I love it.
Right? And they're excited by it, right?
Yes.
And I'd say 80% of the time, not 100%, my response to the crazy idea is I have a couple thoughts to make it crazier, right?
Yes.
Let's if we're going to do this,
let's really
let's do it, right? We're going to stick our neck out and it might get chopped off. Let's really do it. And then you look at them and you see, wow, right? And so And it's, again, like building that culture that says
you can think outside the box.
You can think outside the box. And not only can you, it's encouraged,
Yes.
right? And this is the part, and I always meant it incredibly sincerely, because people say things, right, because it's the right thing to say, that, the people who sort of make a business most valuable are the people on the ground, right?
Yes.
And if you give those folks not just the tools, but the freedom to sort of step outside of what they normally, I'll say, are told to do, but they start saying, this is my idea on how to do this, and this is how I can make this more valuable. It's like, it takes it to another level.
Yeah.
So for a long time, my predecessor at one of the companies I ran, he had a goal. He actually had a team study, how to become the best customer service company in the space. And they look at all these attributes, and they'd say, okay, companies that rank very high, they do these 12 things, and we're going to do all these 12 things, right? And we never got there, right? We never achieved it. And so I took over and I said to them, we're not going to study that anymore. Like, we're just not going to do it. We're going to empower people to tell us what to do, right?
To do the right thing.
So I would sit there with folks in the call center and say, and they'd say, well, we're told we've got to talk for this much time. They keep track of your time. They keep track of this, right? Because we measure everything now.
Sure.
Right? Because we can, not that we know it's important, but we can measure it, right?
That's a good point.
Exactly, right? So you say to them, well, what if, sometimes we're talking to a senior citizen, right? And you have to say it a couple times. And I'm like, so why don't you? Yeah. And it's like, well, we're told the call has to end. And I'm like, let's stop doing that. Let's not do that. We're not going to keep track of it, right?
Yeah.
So you start just listening to people and giving them power. And then lo and behold, we hit the highest as far as customer service, right?
Of
and
course.
So the best was my predecessor calls me. He sees we got this award, right? And it's J.D. Power Award for top customer service, right? And he says to me, so what was it, Morgan? What of those 12 things was it you did? And I said, I don't want to break your heart, but we stopped studying the 12 things.
We went away from
We went away from it. I said, we just took a different approach. I didn't want to completely burst this bubble, right? But it was a moment for me that said, the power of leadership, it's not like how smart you are.
Yeah.
It's not all the brilliant ideas you have.
Yeah.
It's what can you do to literally, and I say it, to make the best version of every employee, right?
Yes.
And I would sit there and say, if you could pick a number of employees you have, so we have probably 500, our goal at Hope to have. If I made 500 people the best version of themselves, like, that's powerful.
Think about the ripple effect of that.
Absolutely.
All the lives those 500 people touch.
And it's a place where, people say they care about me, right? And I'm important, right? And there's enthusiasm for it. And so, and it's been a journey, because I've seen the failure. I've seen where, it was the come on, follow me, and nobody's following you. And it's like, wait a minute, maybe I'm not the person who's supposed to lead. Maybe I'm the person who's supposed to tell people, tell me what to do. Tell me what to do. If we all sit here and said, okay, what can we, how do we do better jobs, right? One of the questions I love asking people, so when you have retirements, right? People have been there a long time. And this has stuck with me forever. And I always say to them, what was the best day you ever had at work, right? Like at work, and tell me what happened, right? So every person who, like, I'd say in the last 5 years who retire, I ask them that question, right?
That's great.
And the common thread, almost like 90%, and it's like who we are as people, right? It involved helping somebody, right? It could have been somebody out in the field, and there was a customer who had a really challenging issue, and they were able to help them, right? And they feel really good about that, right? I feel good about what I do. Or I had a younger employee who was struggling, and I helped, give them some advice, and I work with them. And then I watch them, and all of a sudden they're like blooming into this great leader or doing something, right? And so I sat there and I said, okay, so if every employee's, like, the best day is helping somebody, like, why don't we spend more time helping people?
Yeah, because there's plenty of opportunities to do that.
Absolutely. And whether it's helping a fellow employee, helping a customer, right? And if you say, this is the business I'm in, and then you remind yourself to say, like my goal is for you to have as many of the best days of your work as you can, right? That's one of my goals.
Yeah.
This year, I'd love for you to have, 50 best days, right?
I've never heard of a company say that to their employees. That's great.
And if I said to my number one goal is to provide the best customer service to my customers, right?
Yeah.
What do you think that is?
It's
getting people to say, I want to help somebody,
yes.
right? I had this story of a manager, and he was rough, right? There's like a lot of people in the utility space, it's not necessarily all professional people that have been in the office setting.
Sure.
And I had an HR person who wanted to fire him because he would use vocabulary that wasn't very
office worthy.
Nothing. It was never mean or never like attacking somebody, but it was his reaction, it was his emotion, and I'll never forget this. And she was planted this seed with me and said, "This guy has a real problem." And so I was like, this is like one of the few times in life somebody calls you with a good thing. So a guy calls me and he says, "Morgan, I belong to this church, right? It's in the region, and there was an older woman and they actually put it in the church bulletin. She was driving on a highway, and it was late in the evening, and the sun was going down, and she got a flat tire, and she pulled over, and she didn't have a cell phone. She's an older person, right? And she was scared. She didn't know what to do, and she was sitting there, and she put her blinkers on, and he said, all of a sudden, she sees this utility truck pull over, right? And the guy pulls over, gets out, and says, "Are you okay?" And she says, "I got a flat tire." And he's like, "You don't even have to get out of the car. Just stay in the car. I'll change the tire."
Aww.
Changes the tire, right? And then he goes on his way. And she knows he works for the utility, but she didn't catch his name. She was scared, right? And she drove off. So she actually puts in the bulletin, like, if anyone knows this guy who's driving a utility truck on this highway on this day. So he calls me and he said, "It was your utility company, right?"
Wow.
So we have GPS in people's trucks, right? So I say to somebody, "Can you find out what truck was on this highway on this day," right? And sure enough, it was the manager, right, who's sitting there talking about rough, right? And so I call him, and I'm like, "Was this you?" And he's like, yeah, it was me." And I said, that was awesome that you did that. He said, "I kept thinking that could be my grandmother, right? She'd be sitting on the side of the road." And I'm like, "There's no chance in the world I'm ever firing that guy. He's a keeper, right?" I need to work on his vocabulary a little bit.
You can give feedback on that.
But it's funny. It's like, people. And he felt safe, right? It was safe that he could do that. Like the company wasn't going to say, "Where the heck were you? You were 20
why'd
minutes.
You stop?
You were 20
we
minutes
late. We
noticed
on our GPS that you pulled over.
What did you do, right?" And it was just like you sit there and say, makes you feel good, right? That those are the people you work with, and that's who they are naturally.
Yes.
And so, like, for me as a leader, I can't create barriers from stopping them to be the good people that they are, right? And so it's one of the things then if it gets encouraged and you support it, and all of a sudden the people start talking about it.
Yes.
One of the stories I think I mentioned to you was this was a training class, right, that we're having for new hires, and one of the guys who's been around, he said, "I've been with utilities for 30 years and I'm working here, and I go into a house late at night, somebody calls, it's a gas leak, and he looks around and he sees there's little toys on the floor, so he knows they have kids, right? It's about 11 o'clock, the kids are all in bed, and there's just a father sitting there, and his wife's a nurse, she's working at night, right? They're barely paying their bills, and they're in a not well-to-do neighborhood, right? Yeah. And he goes and checks, and there's a leak going into the furnace, right? Which is one of the bad things that happen in the gas industry. And so by code, right, by law, what we're supposed to do is shut the gas off because it's dangerous.
Sure.
And because it's the customer's appliance, we tell the customer, go call a plumber to go fix your furnace, right? And this guy's sitting there, and he's like, "It's 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah,
These people who's going to come? Can he afford it? Right? All those things." So he's explaining this to the customer, and he says, "If you're okay with it, I think I could fix it."
Wow.
And so he did, and it took him, he said, like over an hour and a half to fix and it worked, right? And he goes home, and he gets up the next morning, and his wife says, "Oh my gosh, you were really late." And he says what I've always hoped people would say. He said, "I had the best day in my career.
Wow.
She said, the best day in your career, you got home at 1 o'clock. Like, what were you doing, right?
Yeah.
He said, I helped this young family, right? And on a really bad day, and I just feel really good about what I do, right? And so he's telling other employees that story, and he says, that's who you're working for. Like, that's who you are, right? And it's such a journey, right? Because you start off with that first meeting with the employees saying, tell me what you know, hold me accountable. And then you evolve to, I want to empower you to do the things that are right, right? And, you know, and those are the kind of things that as a leader, you sit there and you just say, I don't know how long I'm going to sit in this chair.
Yes.
And what's my legacy? Do I want to make a lot of money for my investors? I mean, that's always like a scorekeeping exercise.
Of course, yes.
Right? Or is it that, you know, maybe like, you know, the people that work for you sit there and say, you know what, I became the best version of myself. I got to do things I felt really good about. I came to work, and not every day was the best day of my career, but there was people thinking, how do I help this person have the best day career, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, I have so many different directions I want to go in on that.
Wherever you want to go.
So many questions. I would say, especially from a CEO perspective, I mean, you mentioned scorekeeping, and obviously there are a lot of eyes and a lot of attention on the financial health of the organization. And there's a lot of people that are probably more comfortable in the numbers and the metrics than they are with what you're talking about, relationships and listening and developing other people. It's obvious to me that you see the value in that, but how do you teach others, especially on your own leadership team, that this is something that they should also value and care about and invest time in?
And I think, I don't know, probably because everybody's really focused on social issues today, right? And it's, you know, how do we treat people, and is everybody given equal opportunity? And there were, you know, a number of CEOs of really big companies who came out and said, like, all these social things are really important to us, right? And who knows, maybe they are, right? Maybe they're not so worried about the stock price and everything else. As a cynic, right? I
find that hard to believe.
Yeah, it's like, okay, maybe, you know, like, it's just because it's the hot item today, and it's the right thing to say.
Yeah.
But I honestly, so when I you know, started out in my leadership role, I had this belief, right? And it starts with a fundamental belief that, like, I'm not smart enough, and I'm not, like, the guy who can create significant value for my investors. And it's a terrible thing for a CEO to say.
No,
right?
I find it refreshing. Right? I think it's humble and it's honest.
It's true, right?
I wish more people would say that.
So then I reached the conclusion, the only way I could do that is if I got everybody on my company, everybody in the team focused on what they do. Like, not on necessarily the bottom line, but if everybody focused on what they do and they do the best that they could do at that piece, when you add up all the pieces and you say, okay, we're getting better here, we're getting better there, right? And we're performing at a higher level, and people are happier, they feel good about what they do, right? That ultimately, I mean, this is like a hypothesis, right? Ultimately, you're creating value, right?
Yes.
So the electric company I was at ended up, we sold the company. Somebody came in and paid a big premium for the company, and everybody got happy. And I sat there and said, you know what? Like, I think part of that had to do with the culture of, like, creating something valuable, and somebody saw it. Fast forward to the last company I ran. I started it saying the only way we create value is if we create that we become valuable. I used to say, we're in the natural gas industry. There are people who think fossil fuels are bad. There are people in leadership positions talking about the world without fossil fuels. And I would say to my employees, like, our job is to make ourselves so valuable to our customers that nobody could imagine the world without us, right? We're not there. Like, you don't start there, right? But eventually you sit there and you'd say, imagine West Virginia without Hope Gas, right? Like, that's crazy, because those people, they help people. They're doing all these wonderful things. They're important to our communities. They're creating jobs. They're partnering with people. It's not about fossil fuels, right? It's about the company of what you do, right? And I would sit there and say, you know, there's parts we can play on the environmental side and educate people, but if we create something that our customers view as valuable. Yeah, like some politician's going to say, I'm going to outlaw gas utilities, and people are going to say, I can't imagine not having my company, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you don't start there. I'm not saying in some customers maybe you do, and that's awesome. And so you have to grow. Like you have to. That's a journey that you take people down, and you say, okay, if you do the best you can, and when you're out there at that customer and you're helping them, you're empathetic. You know, customer can't pay his bill. You don't sit there and say, well, here are the rules. Here's what you do, right? You sit there and say, how can we help you? Like, what can we do to help you get past whatever issues you have, right? Companies don't do that, but like people do, right?
Yes.
And that's who people naturally are if you allow them, right? And I sit there, and that's one of the challenges is, you know, you basically say we're all good people. And so if I have a bunch of really good people, which I know I have, and I don't want to get in the way of like rules and limitations and saying, well, that's not what you could do. And I always say, you know, it's the reconciling item. If what you're doing was the headlines of tomorrow's newspaper, would you be proud of it? And say, go ahead and throw a rock at me. I'm helping somebody. I'm doing the right thing.
Yes.
Or would you sit there and say, oh, I want my mother to know about that, right?
Yeah.
Like those are, I mean, that's a simple test, but
it's so true.
Yeah.
It's so powerful.
Yeah, and you just say to folks like, what does that mean for the person who knocks on the door and checks the leak at night? What's it for the person who answers the phone call when the customer calls and they don't have gas, right? Or they can't pay their bill? What does it mean for the person who's in charge of shutting customers off when they don't pay their bills, right? Well, like what does that mean, right? And so you challenge everybody to say, you know what? At the end of the day, if our goal is to do what we think is right as people, right? Like just empower people to do that.
Yeah.
And then hope, right, that they stay within the boundaries of the law. Just kidding.
Yes. Yeah. We know they will.
Absolutely.
We're not worried about that.
No.
But no, I think the fact that you give people that empowerment to do the right thing, because I do find oftentimes people know what the right thing is. They want to do the right thing. And sometimes they just feel, well, I have to do what the manual told me, or because code blah, blah, blah says this. And I'm not saying ignore regulations and rules and laws. But
those are there for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely. But sometimes I think it's our human interpretation that gets us in trouble, because we go to an extreme of what that really means in terms of what we can and can't do.
And there's those, I call it the big company sort of approach to things where, you know, there's somebody who sits in a room and thinks of all the bad things in life that could happen. And then they sit there and say, okay, if we don't allow people to do that, those bad things won't happen. If we don't allow people to do that, right? So there's a whole process. And it's, you know, in business, it just naturally occurs, right? We call it risk management. We call it Sarbanes-Oxley if you're a public company. We call it lots of different things. And I sit there and say, like, those are, we have to follow rules. Like, that's who we are. You know, and I say to people, like, you know, most people don't walk around and shoot a gun and kill somebody, right? We're not robbing banks. We're not. We know the rules. We know right and wrong.
Exactly.
But you know, can you hold the door when somebody is coming that needs help, right?
Yeah.
Can you stop at a light to say, I'm going to let somebody cross, right? Yes.
Will you stop and change a flat tire?
Will you stop and change a flat tire? Would you, in the middle of the night, help somebody who maybe can't help it fix their furnace, right? Like those are the right things, and that's what you feel good about. But it is absolutely a journey, because the one ingredient, I used to think if I tell people like that's what you can do it. Yeah. And then they sit there and say, you know what? I've been not doing it for so long. I don't feel safe doing it, right? So one of the most important things is safety, right? Yes. People, not only do they have to feel like you want them to do it, but they have to feel safe, right?
Yes, that there's not going to be repercussions, retaliation for acting.
And I started with, and this was, you know, one of the fundamentals. I had a meeting at my prior life where we brought all the spouses and families to a get together, and it was a social thing. And I said, you know, there's just going to be 10 minutes of me talking. That's the price of admission. You don't have to pay anything else. And I explained to everybody, including their families, like who we wanted to become.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, and because our jobs, right, at a utility interfere with your personal life, to have those folks on that side of life understand a little bit about who we want to become and how the world's changing and how we have to change. They felt a part of it. They're a part of it whether we include them or not, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They're impacted by wherever their family member works.
And as you know, if you need to leave in the middle of the night to go do something, whether it's your spouse, your kids, right? They understand it, right? You know that as even as a parent, right? When your child understands what you're doing, it makes sense.
Absolutely.
Not only that, like they take pride in it. Like that's who my mom is.
My mom's going to help someone.
She's going to help somebody, right? And if you make it simple, because that's I look at it. What a utility does is it helps businesses, it helps people, whether it's trying to become more competitive in what they're doing or think creatively, those types of things, or it's just how do I pay my bill? How do I get to the next paycheck, right?
Yes.
Those are things as a utility, right? We have all these rules, but nowhere in there does it say, you can't do these things, you can't do that, right? There's things.
There's maybe some little gray areas.
And you start
opportunities to do the right thing.
Opportunity to do the right thing, and I start and end with to say, okay, if somebody reads tomorrow in the paper what we're doing, or we're not going to feel ashamed of it, right?
Yeah.
Because we got good people, and if you believe that, and those are the people that know right from wrong, and you trust them, right? Because trust is part of feeling safe.
Yes.
And you have to be willing to cringe a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But
it's not always going to go perfectly.
It's not always going to go perfectly because everybody's got different stages of what that is. But you know that this is how you can create value is just by everybody becoming. I make it as simple as the best version of yourself, right? And that's to me okay. That I'm fairly convinced. As a leader, that's how I can add value. It's probably the only way I can add value.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. And I want to jump back real quick to something that you were talking about a little bit ago, especially when you're listening to employees. I've noticed sometimes I'll work with organizations where maybe they'll do big town hall meetings where some of the top executives that normally wouldn't be at a certain location, they come in, they say something, they open it up for Q&A.
Right.
Some employee says something that sounds very disgruntled, and then after the meeting, maybe that top executive pulls the site GM aside and says, "Hey, Bill just brought up this issue," and the GM says, "That's just Bill. Bill's always angry." Yeah.
He complains about everything.
Exactly, and a lot of times that behavior gets dismissed. Well, that's just how they are, and they're never happy and they're never satisfied. But I feel like you have a different take on that, and I'd like for you to share your perspective on that.
Yeah. So one of my absolutely first experiences with that type of employee, to me, it's like something that stays with me forever. I got to work with my father, right, who was an Irish immigrant, who had very few words. Had 8th grade education, but he could recite poetry like no one I've ever met. He was well read, right? All those things that the old immigrant, right?
Yeah.
But I worked with him one summer, and we're working as a laborer, and we go into the shop at the end of the day, and everybody's griping about everything, and I'm like, this is the most miserable place, right? I can't wait to leave. I get in the car. And I say to my dad, that's miserable. How do you do that every day?
Yeah.
He said, everybody's, that doesn't have a voice, right? So they're frustrated. So that they all complain to each other. He said, but the other thing is the fact that they're complaining, it means they care.
Yes.
He said, if people stop complaining, that means they don't care anymore.
Yeah,
right?
They don't even care enough to say anything or suggest anything.
You've beaten them down to where that person doesn't care.
Yes.
And it doesn't, there's never an always, right? But there's a almost always that when you listen to those folks who are complaining and you start addressing those issues and make them feel they have a voice. I mean, I've seen almost always that person stops complaining, right?
Me too.
And they become something different, right? Which is, okay, now I feel like I'm important. I feel like people listen to me. And by the way, I'll start, instead of yelling about it, I'll start just talking about it, right? Not always, but almost always, right?
Almost always, yes. I agree with you.
But I'm 100% belief that if somebody's complaining about it means they care, right?
Yes.
And if you start with that as a leader, as opposed
Yeah.
to, I got a lot to do today, I'm here,
I don't want to deal with
I
this
don't want to
person.
deal with this, I've got so many issues I need to do. And it's like, if you're that, you shouldn't be sitting there listening to people, right? You're in the wrong place.
Yeah.
And so I try, not where none of us are perfect, but I always get myself in the right mind frame to say, put all your problems at the door, all the headaches that you deal with.
Yeah.
This is about them, not you.
Yeah.
Right? So,
Yeah.
I always start just giving people updates on things that are going on. And then it's like, okay, tell me what's happening here. Tell me what's the latest.
You said what's keeping you up at night earlier. That's one of my favorite questions to ask people too, because I think that's always, you get really good information out of that question.
Yeah. Yeah. And they, in our industry, there's like the crisis, right? So bitter cold days right before Christmas. People are working around the clock. And I'm thinking the average person doesn't want to get in their car to go anywhere, right? Because it's bitter cold.
Work.
And actually be out there for 10 hours in that cold. And at the end of the day, trying to keep people's houses warm, trying to make their lives. And I'm like, I sit there and say, that's noble work.
It is.
And every time I'm with them, it's like I'm sitting in an office. I'm in a comfortable chair. You guys are out there literally
doing the work
and unsafe, right? And it's funny, because we measure safety because it's really important. From our product to how we deliver it to how we work every day, safety is a really important aspect. And one of the things you always know, and it's true in safety, is when things are like the most dangerous, that's when employees are the safest, right? Because they're focused on what they're doing, they're paying attention, and it's when that calm day when nothing's going on and they're thinking about fishing that weekend or whatever, right? Or some headache in their life. That's when sometimes bad things happen. So part of it is like making sure the company, like we don't control all aspects of people's lives, but I say to them, I don't ever want you worried about things here. So if there's things you're worried about here that causes you potentially not to be safe when you're out on the job, like you need to ask those questions. You need to, and I need to be able to say, don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Here's why, right?
Yeah.
And if I don't know the answer, go figure it out.
Our conversation with Morgan was just too good for one episode. So join us next week for Leadership Rediscovered with Morgan O'Brien, Part 2.